Hello, can you all hear me? So my name is Petra. I am not one of your panelists, but I am going to do a couple of quick readings before we go straight into the film. My father was from Jaffa. He was 4 years old in 1948 when he was ethnically cleansed, like 80% of the Palestinian population. And I've written the first piece that I'm going to read very much as a sort of thoughts that were triggered when watching the film about him. It's sort of like a piece of writing to him. Hopefully it will resonate or trigger something for you guys. If not now, then maybe when you see some of the footage from the film. There is a sea of faces. I watched the flickering footage. Grainy, black and white. An indicator of age, history, time that's passed. I've watched it before. Every time I scan for your face. I don't even know what your face would have looked like as a child, but I feel that I would know. I feel that the child who would create me would be able to feel me watching through this screen portal. I still can't find you in crowds. The searching is painful. Slung over their shoulders are the bundles and bags of the few belongings left, and the less visible burden. The burden of loss, and what will be carried forward that's a greater weight than the lack of physical belongings. The generations that come after you carrying it still. Passing the baton of an enforced relay race whose team may never get weary. They don't know what's to come, that it sometimes feels like the walk I am watching will be a journey without end. That while you cling on and never give up, each generation will have to live in defiance, an exhausting battle that despairs at the indifference and disbelieves the imbalance can be anybody's reality. I watch them still, search for you, and let the sadness in. It lies sometimes quietly underneath every positive act of reclamation, sometimes living loudly visible, taking up space on every available surface of what's left. Now I'm watching these scenes again, familiar footage but in colour, with new faces, and despite wanting to share my outrage with you and to ask all the questions that went unanswered, I'm glad you're not here to carry the burden of this leg of the journey, for it rips open every wound your descendants inherit, fresh pain whose only balm is that it brings a deeper understanding of yours. But I need to find you to tell you that while this looks familiar, there are flowers growing along the road this time. They have started to bloom, a technicolor brightness that can't be ignored, their patterns intersecting to create a new pathway, a better one. Every species is here growing stronger together along this road. They try to flatten and trample, picking off petals, squashing the leaves, but we now know what you knew, that they can try and change our course, attempt to divert and derail, stampede over us, uproot those left, but they can never bury us, for we are seeds, unintentionally dispersed by this storm. They helped us plant a meadow. Thanks. I'm just going to close with one other piece of writing that's kind of like a thank you to everybody here, really. It's a really important film because it's not coming from a Palestinian perspective alone. And this film goes against the grain of what we're being taught at the moment about us all being on hate marches, that being pro-Palestinian is anti-Semitic, and the fights to show that this is about more than one side of a story and that we all need to stand up together to say that. And it's called A Seat at the Table. We enter the house. It feels familiar. My key fits the lock, but we knock. It's only polite. It's not polite to talk about religion or politics at the dinner table, we were told. But the tellers also said children should be seen and not heard. I'm starting to question this wisdom, or rather demands. They seem too convenient. Convenient to be kept in silence, to quiet the young, be seen, not heard, to be given an invite, but no voice at the table. I'd rather be heard and not seen. Invite me in, draw a seat to the table, let's talk. Let's talk politics and religion. Let's fill the silence with the discomfort of uncomfortable conversations as we chew on this together, for it's too much for one. No friends are made or glasses raised by dining on your own. Thanks for coming to the table.
Some American Jews who come here say, we came to Israel and we left from Palestine.
The non-Jewish community does not understand our obsession with Israel.
I went to a Jewish day school.
Summer camp, organized trips to Israel.
You want to go to Israel too? Yeah! We want to go!
Israeli soldiers, they're hot, they're awesome, they're strong.
We actually have had quite a few of our former students join the IDF. And these are kids, these are 18, 19-year-olds. Amazing.
I told my parents I don't even need to apply to college. I'm gonna just join the Israeli military.
10% of my graduating class joined the Israeli army.
We were deployed to the West Bank.
I don't think I realized the extent to which what I would come to see on the ground would really shock me and horrify me.
When people look at the West Bank today and say, this is an apartheid system, it's not just throwing out a word.
Palestinians live in, day out, without experiencing a day of freedom.
You see what non-democracy looks like.
What we've been told is that the only way that Jews can be safe is if Palestinians are not safe. The more I learned about that, the more I came to see that as a lie.
Within the Jewish community, there's been a striking change.
They're really angry at the way they were indoctrinated, justifiably so.
When we talk about we're losing the kids, we lost them. I think they're a little super naive.
Anytime you cut against the grain, you're going to catch hell.
You are a self-loathing Jew. Go kill yourself. An anti-Semitic Jew.
The way that we talk about anti-Semitism isn't about protecting Jews, it's about protecting Israel. How dangerous is that?
They will do anything to preserve unconditional support for Israel.
The great irony is that there actually is resurgent anti-Semitism.
Jews will not replace us!
History is not going to judge us kindly.
Thank you all for coming. I'm Benny. I am involved with Namod, which is a Jewish organization basically aiming to end the Jewish community's support for occupation. We're really, really lucky to have one of the film's producers, Erin Axelman. We've also got on the line Baha Hilo. So Baha lives in Bethlehem in the West Bank, in the occupied West Bank. And Baha runs To Be There, which are educational programs about the history, culture of Palestine. And Baha is an activist and educator, and a very wise sage, I'd say. He's got lots of wise words to share. So hello, Erin. Hello, Baha.
Hey.
I'd like to ask you both, really, to start with, how did you meet? And how did the film come into being?
Want to go Baha first about how we met, or you want me to start?
No, Erin, go on. Then go ahead.
Right. So I was a college student. I was 21 years old, and I had already kind of had the transformation that a lot of the folks talk about in the film. And so I learned about the occupation and the Nakba in high school, and then did Palestine advocacy work throughout college. And had a good mutual friend, her name's Rahel, who had spent time with Baha, who had worked with Baha a little bit. And so I took a semester off from college to live in Palestine for the first time, and I was just looking for people to meet. And then my friend was like, "You gotta hang out with Baha. You gotta hang out with Baha." And so I met Baha in Bethlehem, and we hung out for this first night. And although again I'd known about the occupation for a long time, this was my first time seeing the occupation up close and personal. And the way that he explained the occupation as someone who had actually grown up under military rule, and also Baha, especially the way that you showed me maps about settlement growth around Bethlehem, and that was the first time that I really began to understand the ways in which settlements were created to break up Palestinian land and to make any kind of contiguous Palestinian entity virtually impossible by how the settlements essentially were built to surround and separate Palestinian communities. And so Baha, he changed my life in a big way by really helping to explain the occupation to me. And then when I began making the film in 2016, it was initially just me, and Baha was one of the first people that I wanted to interview. And so Baha let me go along with one of his tours for about a week, 5 to 6 days, I guess. And filming Baha on that trip made me also realize that I really wanted Baha to be a really big part of this film, partly because of the impact he had on me, but also just how brilliant he was at explaining the occupation and Palestinian life to outsiders and to international audiences, especially American Jews.
Thanks, Erin. And Baha?
A common friend told me, like, yeah, I have this brilliant friend who's coming to visit. You guys should meet. And to me, I have always worked on trying to explain the reality the way it is, away from, I explain Israeli criminal behavior the way it is, rather than through propaganda and other kind of filters. And it makes me believe, like, all what you have to do as a survivor of Israeli criminal behavior is to explain that and describe it, So when you just simply like expose the reality the way it is, you expose like Israeli criminal behavior, the common justification for Israeli criminal behavior, the motivations for Israeli criminal behavior, and then at the same time, like, show examples of our survival through this. It kind of like gets people to start the process of understanding reality the way it is, rather than the way it's promoted by mainstream media and all the propaganda machines that work to brainwash like the westernized world into believing that Israeli criminal behavior is some kind of civility. It's always like very, very special to meet people who live up to my understanding of Jewish culture, Jewish values, Jewish traditions, and so on. People who understand, for example, that a Jewish figure like King David is very, very important and essential in our culture. Like when you see a 13-year-old kid throwing rocks at an Israeli military tank, the images implanted in the backs of our minds are of a Jewish kid called David. So it's like trying to just, we're desperate to meet like Jewish people who live up to Jewish identity, Jewish values, Jewish traditions, and just to see how we share those values, but at the same time recognize the level of damage and destruction that is caused by Zionism as just another supremacist ideology that seeks to exploit Jewish identity to justify criminal behavior. In the exact same way we saw Christianity being exploited to justify genocides throughout like Africa, North and South America, and so on, or any other religion really that is being abused to justify criminal behavior by criminals. I do understand it's very, very difficult process somehow to people realizing that they are being indoctrinated, brainwashed, being fooled by the people that they gave so much trust to. So in a way, like I think the bond between me and Erin is like, is unbreakable in a way, because we do have identical understanding of what struggle against apartheid, against criminal behavior, against injustice, how kind of like an important thing it is. So in a way, I do view I do remember the kind of like the period and the moment and the time we met, and I do remember that genuinity, honesty, like agreeing on common grounds, like it brought us to where we are today. And I just think like the production of this film is just a milestone in something that just grew up naturally out of, based on the skills Erin and his team have, and probably the skills I myself have.
Thanks so much, Baha. Perhaps to bring it back to Erin, can you tell us a bit about? So I've seen another interview with yourself and Simone on Al Jazeera, I think it was, and I noticed in that interview you said that sort of Simone's story is your story. Can you talk to us a little bit about your motivations to make the film? Why was there a sort of specific moment when things changed for you? Can you describe that a bit?
Totally. Yeah. So my story is very similar to Simone's, but not exactly the same. And again, obviously, there's a huge diversity in American Jewish life in terms of how we learn about Israel. But most of us learn about Israel in a similar way to how Simone and Eitan learn about Israel. Mine was not as intense. My Hebrew school didn't talk about Israel that much, actually. Our rabbi was born well before the state of Israel was created. And to him, Judaism was Torah for the most part. But for my bar bat mitzvah, I was given a bunch of kind of pro-Israel kind of Zionist novels. And reading these novels as a really young kid, they really spoke to me. They really were incredibly inspiring. They spoke about Israel as the kind of light at the end of the tunnel after millennia of oppression. And they talked about Jewish redefinition and Jewish power in a way that as a young kid, as a 15-year-old kid, was incredibly compelling. Israel really became my Jewish identity, like many of the people in the film. And very luckily, though, I went to a random public high school in rural Maine. My parents were kind of hippies. And I had this teacher, this really amazing Irish American teacher, who I took an independent study with my senior year of high school. And you could study whatever you wanted the entire year, and you made a documentary at the end. So I was going to study Israel, and I was obviously going to make a very pro-Israel documentary. And he knew my family, he knew me, and he was just shocked by how pro-Israel I was, because he knew how progressive my family and I were. And at one point early on in the year, he asked me a very simple question, which changed my life. And he said, do you know anything about Palestinian history? And I began thinking about it, and I realized that I didn't. And I realized that all the books that I was reading, all the narratives that I was reading, didn't talk about Palestinians at all. The traditional pro-Israel narrative either pretends Palestinians don't exist, or if it acknowledges they exist, it suggests they are something to be dealt with, as opposed to their own people with their own rich history who had simply been living there when the Zionist movement began. And so over the course of this year, he gave me all of these books, both by Palestinian historians, Palestinian American historians, and actually, very importantly to me, left-wing Israeli historians. I was actually reading left-wing Israeli historians specifically talk openly about the Nakba and the occupation. That made me realize that there was this entire other side of the story that I had not been told. And it made me realize that the traditional pro-Israel narrative was very similar to the traditional American narrative that we learned about in school. To us in public school in America, the history either suggests that Native Americans barely exist, or if they exist, they are something to be dealt with, and that their lives are less valuable or less precious than white European lives. And so it made me realize that, again, that I had a lot of learning to do, and I began doing pro-Palestinian kind of advocacy work in college. And it was really seeing so many people like Simone and Eitan in college who had actually gone to Jewish day school, who'd had a much more intense pro-Israel education than I had, seeing them change profoundly when they came into contact with Palestinians and Palestinian narratives, seeing almost all the pro-Israel leaders on my campus begin doing Palestinian human rights work within about 4 to 5 years. The worst one, it took him 10 years. So the kind of head of our university's Students for Israel group, it took him 10 years. But he now openly calls Israel an apartheid state. He fights tirelessly for Palestinian freedom. And so seeing all of these young people change when they simply came into contact with Palestinian history made me realize that my transformation and my story was part of this incredibly large transformation that's occurring on a generational basis. And again, polling shows that, obviously our film shows that this is a common story qualitatively, but polling from 2021 from the Jewish Electoral Institute, which is kind of a mainstream American Jewish org, shows that about 40% of young Jews under 40 in America, think Israel is an apartheid state. And that if 40% of us believe Israel is an apartheid state, I do believe at least 50% of us realize something is fundamentally wrong with how Israel has treated the Palestinians. And polling even today, and even though AIPAC and other orgs try to make it seem like even calling for a ceasefire is anti-Semitic, which is obviously absurd, polling shows that over 50% of American Jews want a ceasefire right now. Only about a third of American Jews want this genocidal campaign to keep going. So my realization that my own story was incredibly common and part of this huge transformation is what led me to want to make this film.
The film is obviously about Jewish experience, and that's, I think, in some ways a story that hasn't been told so much actually in relation to Israel, so it's a really important one. I'm also aware that the sort of situation on the ground in Palestine is only getting worse. So I actually want to ask Baha maybe if sort of what I think. So you watched the film with us today as well, Baha.
It's actually the first time I watched the film ever since the beginning of the genocide.
Can you talk to us a little bit about what it's like watching the film in that context?
To be honest with you, like the narrative of the film, the kind of description that was going on during the production of this film, kind of like I come from a point of view where this is natural outcome of Israeli criminal behavior. The only missing thing is now the examples used of Israeli criminal behavior do not include the genocide. But it's a built-up for the understanding, like, if you're unable to understand that actually it's profoundly wrong to fool a kid into becoming a criminal, then those are the limits that we go on. Like, there are few refuseniks in the film that I'm sure are portrayed as like as positive as a person who realizes that committing crime is wrong, So those people got a chance to realize that. I'm talking about Itan, I'm talking about Abner, who were mentioned in this film. But you need to understand that the thing that shaked Itan altogether is like getting a Palestinian from a checkpoint and watching him being like beaten up, and that shaked something in him. The people who are conducting the genocide today, there is nothing that shakes them. Even like pulling the plug of babies on incubators do not shake them. So in a way, like Palestinians from my grandfather's generation to my father's generation, my generation, my nephews and nieces, and you see like many voices of young Palestinians as early as like 12 years old, saying you like, we are forced to survive savage behavior. Why are we as Palestinians forced to survive the criminal behavior and have the supporters of this criminal behavior that this is profoundly wrong, and they are not convinced? And when the genocide happens and goes on, you still have those people unconvinced. Why? Because the process Israelism exposed is still successful with those people, So there are so many contradictory things that have been going on. And one of the, of course, like I'm a person who criticizes himself very much. I started saying like, oh, why did I use that word? But like all the language that I used at that time was very, very relevant to the time of the production of this film. But we have shifted so much beyond saying the state of Israel is a criminal regime because it conducts apartheid policies, where now the state of Israel is a criminal regime because they have been conducting a genocide for 6+ months now. And it's like, when is when are we going to expose the man in power whether in the BBC or in Sky News or on Westminster or in the Israeli embassy in London, to expose those people as defenders, supporters, and beneficiaries of the Israeli criminal behavior that you see right before your eyes happening now in Gaza. You know, so like there's so much that comes with putting Israelism in the context of genocide. And I do also understand, I profoundly understand, like in the words of James Baldwin, that racism is a white man's problem. You know, this is why a person as brilliant as James Baldwin could not fix it. It's not he could not fix it because he's an idiot. He could not fix it because it's not his problem. And inspired by that, I got to reconfirm this through the process of Israelism, that when we start dealing with Zionism as a Jewish man's problem, you know, we have better chances to resolve it than if it's left for the survivors of the brutality and savagery of Zionism to actually, try to like fix that problem. And in the end of the day, like supremacist ideologies cannot be in a way fixed by those who support it or benefit from it. Like we need people who understand that their identity is being exploited to justify criminal behavior, you know? And once that happens, like until that actually happens, we are forced to continue to survive the criminal behavior of the state of Israel until, you know, defenders, supporters, and beneficiaries of the state of Israel are held responsible.
Thanks so much, Baha. Yeah, and I appreciate that this isn't some abstract, thing in a film for you. This is an everyday reality that you're living through. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts there. I guess sort of connected to that, I'm thinking sort of, and maybe Erin, you can reflect on this as well, sort of seeing what's happening at the moment with the college protests in the US. And I think, I don't know, for myself, you know, it does give me hope, even though it's an incredibly dark time, and the thing that's prompted them. I heard a quote the other day from, there's apparently attributed to Ben Gurion, one of the founders of Israel, that said that one of the greatest challenges to Zionism would be a robust, safe diaspora, which I thought was actually something that gives me hope, because I think seeing what's going on in the US, and you know, the fact that we're having this film here and the fact this film was even made, do you see hope with sort of some of the change that you're seeing in the US?
Yeah, I mean, our team has been participating and kind of helping some of the encampments in very small ways. We've done some screenings actually already at some encampments on U.S. college campuses. Simone has spoken at some. I spoke yesterday at Harvard University's encampment. And yeah, it's very bizarre that in the U.S. there is so much news coverage of kids protesting genocidal violence peacefully in tents, and there's not very much, and there's far more news coverage of that, of literally kids in tents protesting genocide, than the actual genocide itself. And that is absurd. The fact that the U.S. kind of media and U.S. college administrators and even members of the U.S. government are more concerned by students peacefully protesting in tents than they are by genocidal violence shows how absolutely tragic the priorities are of many in the U.S. and internationally. The fact that they see kids in tents as a threat and they don't see genocidal violence as a threat is insane, is truly insane. And again, you know, it's also ironic that many of these encampments are called anti-Semitic in a blanket way, when again, you know, a massive proportion of the students in these encampments are Jewish. I was at Harvard's encampment yesterday, and there was a massive Shabbat service. I don't know how many of the students were Jewish, but probably 100 students were Jewish. A massive proportion of them were Jewish, and we had a discussion about what Jewish solidarity means in this moment. And so, there are certain students certainly who feel discomfort or feel uncomfortable with the encampments. But again, it's important to note that South African students in the U.S. would have felt very uncomfortable probably when students were protesting South African apartheid. And just because they were uncomfortable doesn't mean that that was not right. If you are on the side of the oppressor, when people talk to you about that, it's probably going to make you uncomfortable. And again, what I also think is very important is that there's so much discussion about college students' level of comfort when there's literally a genocide going on. And the feelings of college students is talked about more than real genocidal violence. And so I think the kind of hubbub and the obsession with these encampments, as opposed to the actual focusing on what we should really be focusing on, which is the genocide in Gaza, I think is kind of a microcosm of how this of the themes we talk about in Israelism, and how people have talked about Palestine forever. They focus on kind of our feelings as opposed to the actual reality on the ground. Even when it comes to Zionism, there's so many discussions in the U.S. about what Zionism means to young Jewish people, as opposed to what Zionism actually has meant to Palestinians, who have actually had to deal with Zionism in a real way, and who have been victims of Zionism. And so, although it's absurd to see the ways in which this is being covered in the news media, it is very encouraging. And it also shows that if you try to repress peaceful protest through violent means, it usually doesn't work. Again, similarly, people have tried to shut down our film screenings tens of times at this point, and it never works, because people begin wondering, why are college administrators so scared of a film made by Jewish people? And people revolt, and people make sure our film is screened. When college administrators literally call national police forces, or threaten to call the National Guard on peaceful protesters sitting in tents on college campuses, it makes young people think, why do they care so much about kids sitting in tents that they're going to call the National Guard? And it increases that protest movement in a massive way. If Columbia's president hadn't called in the NYPD, the New York Police Department, to clear the first encampment, I don't think these encampments would have sprung up all over the country. And so the repression of this free speech only increases the demand for this free speech, and only makes people realize, why are these nonviolent, very reasonable voices being repressed? So I am hopeful in that. At the same time, my dad and many of my relatives protested the Vietnam War and fought for civil rights in the U.S., and it took them years and years and years. And so we have to, this is not going quickly enough. No movements for justice go quickly enough. And so I'm hopeful, but it's also tragic that, we haven't even had a ceasefire yet. Even these basic small things are still out of our grasp.
Thanks, Erin. I've asked you a few questions, but I'd quite like to open it up to the floor.
Are there pro-Palestinian Israelis in Israel? And are they heard by Israelis or the world media?
Yeah, great question. And Baha actually could probably speak to this even more than I can. But yes, there certainly are. And again, what we consider pro-Palestinian depends on people's definition. There are certainly many, many people in Israel who are deeply critical of Israel's actions, both in the present and historically. Again, we highlight this group called Breaking the Silence, which is a group of former Israeli military veterans who speak out against the apartheid that they participated in. They probably don't call themselves anti-Zionists, but again, they are hated by the Israeli government strongly. When I was actually filming Avner, when I was filming, even though Avner, again, Breaking the Silence isn't even explicitly an anti-Zionist org, when I was filming him for the first time, he mentioned that only a few weeks before we filmed him, police caught a man going to their offices with a gallon of gasoline to burn down their offices. Whether or not they would have, who knows? But the level of vitriol that even kind of, moderately progressive orgs like Breaking the Silence deal with, just for openly talking about literally what they did, just in their military service. The amount of backlash they get shows how difficult it is to be pro-Palestinian or to talk openly about the ways that Palestinians are forced to live in Israel. It's also important to note that, again, especially since October 7th, the level of repression for both Palestinian citizens of Israel and left-wing Israelis is insane. Again, there was an example of a public school teacher just talking about the fact, talking to his students about the fact that maybe killing 30 times as many Palestinians as were killed October 7th isn't the best idea. And he was fired, and I believe he was arrested. And I've had many Israeli friends who are terrified of being arrested just for commenting on social media posts. So part of the issue is that, again, many Israelis live in much more of an intense bubble than American Jews do, and they never meet Palestinians or have any understanding of basic facts about Palestinian life. But there's also, despite that ignorance, there's also a mass campaign to silence those voices and to repress those voices. Yeah, Baha, what's your experience been in terms of, how significant is the kind of anti-Zionist or very left-wing movement of Israeli Jews?
Like the motivation for from my experience, like what I understand about beneficiaries of Israeli criminal behavior who do not, let's say, approve 100% of the policies of the State of Israel. It's always like a confusing because it's based on a confused reality. Like I love the benefits that I'm getting from this criminal regime, but I don't like that they murder so many Palestinians. It's like, because we mention apartheid South Africa as like a milder version of what we are surviving here. It's like having a white person in the south of Africa enjoying apartheid, but at the same time, uncomfortable about like the barbaric and savage outcomes of apartheid. So it's like a mature position that is not rooted profoundly in, in anti, let's say, oppression or anti-apartheid or anti-genocide and so on and so forth. I believe also like we celebrate we celebrate people like breaking the silence, even though they are soldiers who committed crime, and then realized that it was wrong. And we celebrate them because of the number of Israeli soldiers who go on committing crime and don't see anything wrong with it as the norm. I did have like the actor from Breaking the Silence in the heart of the city of Hebron, when there were like Israeli criminal soldiers like detaining Palestinians. And he was like, I told him at some point, you were one of those criminals. And like, yes, and I stopped. And I was like, maybe when we realize that we committed crime, there is a process beyond admitting to the crime, and it's like very, it's very weird. It's like, you are celebrated for stopping to lynch people, but also what happened to the processes of lynching people? What happens to justice here? So in a way also like how the Israeli system uses left-wing Israelis to empower itself and increases its immunity, So at least like those voices will confuse the audience about the true nature of the regime. It gives people this kind of fake hope that if Palestinians coexist better with those nationalists, things will be better, It's like, apartheid South Africa had a lot of white people who never approved of the savage and criminal behavior of apartheid. I do not believe that a racialist society has 100% of people approving the criminal behavior of such a racialist society. Like decent people are here and there, but like I do believe that the Israeli regime has been empowered so much. The fact that they are there enables people who are genuinely committed to the criminal nature of the supremacist and criminal nature of the regime to bully them, you know? Like the entire right-wing bloc of the State of Israel uses anti-Zionist Israelis as evidence, as like target for bullying. So when you bully somebody who's trying to be decent, the message you give to the public, you know, is like if you join them or you have shared a view with them, you know, you will be subject to bullying, you will be subject to attack, you will not enjoy 100% of the privileges that this racist regime is giving you. So in a way, like it also contributes to this fake hope that things change from within, you know? Like I heard so many people saying like, you know, I have to appeal to Israelis. And I tell people the fact. And the fact is, if 100% of Jewish Israelis, 100%, not one, 100%, you know, realize that Palestinian people have been surviving our oppression, and we need to vote for a party that will remove that oppression and will install freedom, equality, and justice, then none of those people will find a party to vote for. Because like there is one thing that the Israeli regime have fooled people into believing, which is that the State of Israel is ruled by the will of the people. No, the State of Israel is not ruled by the will of the people. The State of Israel is ruled by an ideology. You know, any political party in the State of Israel that has a platform rooted in equality is not allowed to run for elections by law. The Israeli election law has a line in it that says that no party is allowed to run for elections if they negate the Zionist Jewish identity of the regime. So if you are a Jewish Israeli person who recognizes the humanity of Palestinian human beings and who want to, you know, have a political struggle to help those people achieve their freedom, you have no room in Israel. So like the entire thing about, you know, left-wing Israelis, for us as Palestinians, like many of us actually work with left-wing Israelis because of our despair. Like, you know, we're survivors of oppression and of a regime that keeps forcing us to believe that we're subhumans. So when you have a beneficiary of that regime recognizes our humanity, we are desperate, you know? So we also get fooled and so on. So in the end of the day, the best way, like to summarize what I'm saying, is a Native American wisdom that sounds like this: right wing and left wing are two wings for the same bird. The problem is with the bird, and the bird, the natural outcome of Israeli behavior is what I have been surviving for every single day of my life for the past 44 years.
Thank you, Baha. We had some more questions.
I just wanted to comment on, both of you referred to, when you're talking about Zionism, you were referring to it as a Jewish movement, which for the longest time, that's what I believe. But for very recently, I came across some very interesting statistics which I didn't know about. But apparently in 2013, there was research collecting religious data from the US, and they found that 82% of evangelical Christian Protestants believed that Israel was the land of Israel was gifted from God to the Jewish people, as opposed to 40% of the Jewish people in America. So actually it's as if like the evangelical Christian, so Zionism is predominantly a Christian movement as opposed to a Jewish movement. And I think a lot of people were saying that it's actually anti-Semitic to think that Zionism is Jewish. But it's actually, we see millions more. There's actually millions and millions more Christian Zionists, more than there are Jews at all, let alone Zionist Jews. And apparently for every Jewish Zionist, there are 30 Christian Zionists. So I want to see what you guys thought about that. Were you aware of this, or?
Yes, many Christians and Christian evangelicals are Zionists for a variety of reasons. Most of them are very bizarre. Most of them are either messianic or overtly racist. Again, even a few days ago, or I guess last week, there's a U.S. congressperson who was grilling the head of Columbia University. And the head of Columbia University is a Muslim Egyptian woman. And this guy was saying literally, and if you haven't seen it, you should look it up. And he says, well, and he's a Southern accent. He says, the Bible says that God has a agreement with the people of Israel to give them that land. And if you don't allow that, God will curse you. And he literally said to the president of an Ivy League school, he said, do you want God to curse Columbia University? And she said, no, I don't want God to curse Columbia University. And I was like, are you seriously being in discussion with this person? Like, is this a real thing? Like, in the halls of US Congress, this guy is literally saying that we need to support the modern ethno-state of Israel because of a book that was written, 2,000 years ago that says that God created a covenant with the people of Israel. And it's just so bizarre. But this guy, this congressperson, truly believed this. I mean, you could see it in his eyes. He truly, truly believed that he had to support the modern state of Israel, which is very different than the biblical people of Israel, because of a covenant that God has with the Jewish people. And so there's a variety of very, very strange, again, either messianic or overtly racist reasons why a lot of white Christians in America support Israel. Many of them truly believe that for the second coming of Christ to occur, the Jewish people need to return to the land of Israel. Again, they don't mention usually the fact that in that scenario, when Christ comes back, the Jews will either have to convert to Christianity or go to hell. They don't really talk about that much. And again, that's what's so sad about this, is that they are using us. They are using Jews for their bizarre messianic prophecies, and we are using them. Many Zionist American Jews know that these people do not actually have our best interest at heart. They don't actually care about Jewish people. They just have this bizarre biblical prophecy that actually ends up with us dying and going to hell. But because they support Israel in this moment, we are going to use them as well. So it's this very, very bizarre reason. Again, there's also Christians who don't necessarily believe that fully bizarre messianic prophecy, but they just view Israel as part of Judeo-Christian values, or they think Israel is more similar to the West than Palestinians are. And so there's just kind of a racist affiliation with the more white Israelis and the kind of closer to Christian Israelis. And that's why they support them. But no, although Zionism obviously has support amongst many Jews, and obviously was created initially by Jewish people, it always had support from many Christians, and in this present day has support from many, 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 many Christian nationalists. What's your perspective, Baha?
It actually makes no sense. Like to me, like the fact that you have racist Christians support like people that they always hate. Like the anti-Semitism is rooted in right-wing Christianity anyways. The absurd thing is that you have people who are willing to betray Jewish values in order to appeal to that corrupt, that anti-Christian kind of viewpoint. What I understand about Zionism, it's rooted in something that is extremely racist. You need to have, people who identify with Jewish identity to actually give in or submit to this racist trend of like, oh, we have a Jewish problem. So you have people who, instead of like fighting the racist, nature of saying that there is a Jewish problem, you had people who are submissive to it, and took advantage of it and keep saying that the state of Israel is the answer to so-called Jewish problem. That's like what I'm saying is like, it doesn't matter who supports this kind of ideology. It's rooted in racism, and there are, yes, the majority of people who identify with Jewish faith are not Zionist, and the majority of Zionists around the world are not Jewish. But in the end of the day, like, both kind of things need the same thing. Please understand that empowering defenders or empowering like the Zionist voices to have a monopoly over the representation of Jewish identity was not done by Jewish people themselves. You know, that was done by the exact same people who are persecuting Jewish people for speaking up right now. The police that is attacking and arresting Jewish students right now, none of them has like a Jewish background. So in the end of the day, like, who enables those voices? But who supports who, and so on. Like, that is the game that actually we are not part of, but we're in the receiving end of that kind of like, let's say, if you want to call it a racist alliance between different forms of supremacists. Please understand that the state of Israel, or Zionist ideology in general, has done more harm to Jewish identity in the Middle East than any savage that tried to, you know, eliminate Jewish identity from the Middle East over the past 4,000 years. Right now, if I tell you like if I say the term that was very, 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 very normal before Zionism, the term like Arab Jews, that term is gone, you know, and it is gone simply because of the behavior of, you know, submitting to this assumption that the only people who are allowed to speak on behalf of Jewish people around the world are the State of Israel. You know, right now you have a minister of internal security in the State of Israel who is of an Iraqi background. He's an Arab Jew. His name is Ben Gavir. But if you tell him like, hey, dude, you are an Arab Jew, he will have a brain stroke. Because as a beneficiary of Israeli criminal behavior, you are conditioned to believe that there is a problem between Arabs and Jews. So Arab Jews are a walking problem. So in the end of the day, like, the alliance itself, you know, we should not be pointing out saying like Jewish people support this, Christian people support this, blah, blah, blah. Like, in the end of the day, like, it's not a Jewish person or a Christian person, or it's a racist person finding an ally with another racist person. And that alliance results on the elimination of the Palestinian people. When people tell me that the State of Israel is a Jewish state, I only say like, I wish the State of Israel was Jewish. Like, I do not know if people understand this. Like, it was Jewish prophets who taught us that we should not kill. It's Jewish prophets who taught us that we should not steal. The problem of the Palestinian people is not that the State of Israel is Jewish to begin with. Like, our experience of the Israeli form of Jewishness is covered with murder and theft in the exact same way when people go around saying Israel is a democracy, blah, blah, blah. Like, we do not suffer from Israeli democratic behavior. We suffer from Israel's lack of democratic behavior. So in the end of the day, like, I think like it's oversimplification to say it's Christians who support this more than Jews. Like, today you have a category of Muslim Zionists, you know? So it's like more Muslims. Like, today we can say like probably there are more Muslim Zionists than there are Jewish Zionists. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who started the problem. The problem is going on, and it's just like eliminating the entire Palestinian society before our eyes. Like, there was this racist guy from the ADL in the film who was saying like, the conversation about what the solution will be should happen later. It's like, yeah, after our elimination, you can have a conversation over the issue. So in the end of the day, I do not like the language of pointing out fingers on Christians or Jews or whatever. I do not really care who enables, supports, benefits from Israeli criminal behavior, because that's irrelevant. What's relevant to us is that this regime is eliminating us out of existence and has been doing so for the past 75 years.
So, at this time we're seeing a lot of protests happening around the world, especially in academia in the United States. You talked about it, the students are getting repressed for it. We're calling during the protest, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. We're calling for an intifada. And those people are being called anti-Semitic, calling from the river to the sea, freedom from the river Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, calling on the death of all the Jews of Israel. That's what people think we mean. And at the same time, the Palestinian struggle involves Palestinian resistance. And I was wondering if in this discourse, do you, in a way, support the armed Palestinian resistance? Because I feel like it's core to the soul of the resistance itself.
Well, to be frank, it's none of my business, to see, it's none of my business, what kind of tools that were used in the fight against apartheid South Africa were. Now, there are certain tools that are compatible with my ethics. There are tools who contradict my ethics. But at the end of the day, I can say I am with this tool, I am against that tool. But it's very wrong of me to say, because some survivors of apartheid in South Africa use some violence, I think they are doing it wrong. Who am I to decide how oppressed people, what kind of tools oppressed people use in their struggle against the oppression that they are forced to survive? I think the most brutal, form of violence is the violence and savagery of colonialism and apartheid and supremacy in general. Now, Palestinian violence is being abused in the exact same way that violence of oppressed people have been described to the white man all along. It's a form to delegitimize struggle against oppression. One of the things, you use the word intifada. Intifada means shake up. You need to shake up the status quo. As an 8-year-old person, I was involved with intifada. How was I involved in intifada? I was going to school because the Israeli army shut down our kindergartens and schools. Now, the defenders of the state of Israel ignored that. The beneficiaries of the state of Israel ignored that. The supporters of the state of Israel ignored that. And they focused on, people who are throwing rocks at Israeli military vehicles. And they said, oh, you see this amount of violence? In the end of the day, delegitimizing a struggle for justice by focusing on things that you don't understand or you don't approve of is meaningless. The other thing that we need to understand, is that Palestinian violence is not an expression of our culture. Palestinian violence is an outcome of oppression. Right now, everybody looks at the Islamic resistance movement. There is so much I have to say about that party among my Palestinian peers. We discuss that. We discuss how I, for example, have certain positions against or with this political party. The Islamic resistance movement was formed in 1988. It's a typical outcome of Israeli oppression. It's not the reason for Israeli oppression. But in the end of the day, we are shifting the discussion from the fact that Palestinians are being forced to survive Israeli oppression, and they are not coexisting with Israeli oppression in a nice, civilized way that's appealing to mainstream media in the West. But in the end of the day, it's not my business to judge, a struggle for equality and freedom based on tools I like or tools I don't like. The majority of the Palestinian people in Gaza were not the 20,000 militants, But at the end of the day, I see how this is an entertaining debate in Western media. And once again, as James Baldwin said, we can agree to disagree and still love each other unless our disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of humanity. That's what I have to say. Sorry.
If I can add something, there's a really great quote by Angela Davis in this film called "The Black Power Mixtape," and basically it's set in 1972, and she's, I believe, in jail at that point. And someone asks her about whether or not she approves of violence being done by Black Americans fighting for civil rights, and she has this really amazing quote where she says, "Quote: You asked me whether I approve of violence. That just doesn't make any sense at all. Whether I approve of guns. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Some very, very good friends of mine were killed by bombs that were planted by racists. I remember from the time I was very small, the sound of bombs exploding across the street and the house shaking. That's why when someone asks me about violence, I find it incredible, because it means that person asking that question has absolutely no idea what Black people have gone through and experienced in this country from the first Black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa." Unquote. And I think, again, what that really shows is that, again, Israel has maintained its control over the entirety of the land from the river to the sea through violence. Israel has only been able to maintain that control through ruthless violence. The colonization of the West Bank can only be maintained through violence. That's why when I went to the West Bank for the first time as a young person, you see what colonization looks like in real time. And colonization can only be won through brutal violence. Just like, again, America was only, quote unquote, won. America was only colonized through extreme levels of violence. And so it's very important to talk about what violence means in that context of colonization. It's also important to note that, in the US, as Americans were colonizing the continent that is now the US, Native Americans resisted violently all the time. And sometimes that violence included killing civilians, killing children. I, of course, don't agree with that at all, but I think we can understand that that is part of a context of being colonized. And when you are being colonized through violence, because colonization can only occur through violence, oftentimes you feel there is no other way to respond than besides violence. I'm very lucky in that I have not had to experience colonization in real time. I have not had to experience apartheid. I have not had to experience being colonized. But I think it's more important, while I condemn the killing of civilians in any case, period, of course, it's very important to note why and when people talk about violence. And it's usually when it's talking about Palestinians, as opposed to the actual structural violence that has been imposed upon the Palestinians for 75 years. And in this present moment, obviously, the genocidal violence that's being wrought upon Gaza. So I think it's important to note, again, is to talk about where violence comes from and the structures of violence, as Angela Davis points out.
Thank you both. I thought it was important to get some lived experience of I guess, relating the film Israelism to the British experience. We've got here Michal, who is a Canadian Jew, am I right? A writer, an academic. We've got Geraldine.
Yeah, Geraldine. I'm, yes, British, Jewish, and I am. I was a housing lawyer, and now I work for the Housing Ombudsman, so I adjudicate on disputes.
And Ella?
Hi, I'm Ella Saltmarsh, a British Jew, and I work with social movements.
So I wonder if we can begin by starting with, what was your relationship to Israel growing up, if any?
So my relationship was potentially a little bit different. I grew up in Canada to Israeli parents, and we lived in an almost exclusively Israeli community in Canada. So it was this kind of little bubble, this little diasporic bubble. But I also went to Jewish day school, like the people in the film, from, grade 1, as we called it, up until the end of high school. And it was just very resonant with the film. And I would, I went to Israel a few times as a kid.
Yes, well, this film definitely resonated with me. I was brought up with the same myths about, what is now the land of Israel being a desert. There was nobody there. There was the people who were there left of their own accord. So all these things, and so when I was about 10, my ambition was to be an Israeli soldier, especially as they were allowed women, and now I feel the complete opposite. Is that I keep having fantasies about standing in front of the IDF and saying stop. But yeah, that's how things were. So I mean, I had to used to keep reminding myself. I mean, my parents were very pro-Israel, as you can imagine, and I used to have to remind myself they were brought up in a very different time when what I would call there was actual anti-Semitism, but things have moved on a lot. Okay.
So yeah, I grew up in a very secular context, and so in a secular context, in a wider family that wasn't so secular, and so Israel didn't come up until I was in my late teens, and I started to meet young Israelis who'd just come through the army, and it was through them that I first went to Israel as an 18-year-old, and that was where, like, I kind of experienced, I guess, the journey that was being documented in the film. On the one hand, spending time in the kibbutz of very religious relatives in the Golan Heights, and then where there was a lot of conversation about they really wanted my grandma to make sure that my Jewish heritage was documented so that it would be easy for me to marry. That was really important. And then on the other hand, going into the occupied West Bank, speaking to people there, I was running a refugee organisation at my university back in the UK. And just as an 18-year-old, seeing that juxtaposition and realising like that something was really, really deeply wrong, and then coming back and realising that there was lots of family members who didn't agree with what was happening in Israel, but that they would be silent about that. And so I started to kind of understand the silences differently, and I guess on a personal level to become much more active in the fight for Palestinian justice. But yeah, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, I guess if I speak from my own experience as well, I think in some ways I grew up in a bit of a bubble, in that like, I was very much kind of, I went to Passover, I went to Hanukkah with my grandparents sometimes, and like Israel comes up during the, when you're reading the Haggadah, like it's mentioned, and I was probably like a bit perplexed. I was like, oh, why are we talking about Israel? But but the rest of the time, like, was brought up definitely kind of against what I knew Israel was doing in Palestine and going on Palestinian solidarity marches. So I remember going to university and then meeting 2 other Jewish students in my Spanish class, and feeling like, oh great, lush, oh that's nice, we've got some shared experiences there. And then we went around for drinks one evening, and all of a sudden at the end of the night they said, they poured out shots and they said, to Israel, and I was like, what? I was like, no. To Palestine, surely, or like, and then we managed to settle on for peace. But like, that blew my mind. I was like, yeah. So I think my experience is not necessarily representative, but it is a Jewish experience as well. And yeah, I guess we're kind of maybe unified by not sharing, a love of Israel, to put it mildly. Can you talk a little bit, or can we talk a bit about what it sort of means to be a non-Zionist or an anti-Zionist Jew? Because I don't know if everyone knows. I mean, you see some of it in the film, but yeah, I think, can you maybe talk about some of the responses that you've had? And that might be from family, it might be from randomers. could be from, you know, other people in the Jewish community. What does it mean?
I was going to come back to your point about, you know, when they said to Israel and the Passover Seder, you know, we're just celebrating Passover now, and I've got young kids who said, what is this? Why do we keep talking about Israel? And in the Passover Seder, Israel just is the other name for the patriarch Jacob, which was meant to represent the Jewish people. It was never, ever biblically intended to mean a state. That's just not what it means within Judaism at all. And so it was very useful to be able to explain that to my child the other day. But in terms of kind of experiences of being a non-Zionist, well, I would consider myself an anti-Zionist Jew. First of all, that has been a massive journey. So as a child, so my family are these Arab Jews that were mentioned. My father's family are from Turkey. And I remember my uncle taking us to the city of Nablus when I was 12 years old. And that was my first encounter with actual Palestinians, was just going to this market, sitting and listening to my Turkish uncle speak Arabic with people, getting these beautiful little gold earrings from him as a gift. But then that somehow faded into the distance, and this kind of really Zionist kind of upbringing continued until kind of transformation, where I was very lucky to have friends from a more liberal background who traveled to Palestine and did this, kind of were exposed to the oppression and the suppression of Palestinians much earlier than I had been, and sort of having that kind of catch on as I went to university and started to read and stuff. And so as I started to go to university and start to read and start to go along to protests or start to sort of engage in online debates that were much more critical of Zionism, that's when it started to hit me that this is something so heavily policed. Because from very early on, when I moved to this country, sort of 20 or so years ago, there were immediate attacks on me as just being cast as an evil person. So I was called a capo. The capos were the Jews that helped the Nazis to murder the Jews systematically. So I was labeled a capo. I was tried to be they tried to scare me into submission, into silence. To be honest with you, in the early years, it kind of sometimes succeeded. But it wasn't until I went and lived in Israel during my PhD studies while I was researching for my PhD, which was on Israeli nationalism and borders. And it was while I was there that I was my politics were transformed and kind of changed through being kind of engaging in Jewish and Palestinian sort of usually women's movements, kind of women jointly resisting the state. But we were attacked over there. We were spat on. We were, the violence is kind of more physical and direct there. And then here, it's just been more modes of exclusion. Kind of, you're not one of us. There's this stuff that's kind of, at the moment, hurled at any Jews who are anti-Zionist, saying you're not real Jews. I was talking to a couple of people here today about that.
Yeah, that really resonates. And partly when I was invited to speak on this panel today, I was like, I don't think I'm the right kind of Jew to do this. Like, I don't, I'm from a really secular background. And then I kind of was like, wait a minute, what is going on in my head there? And actually, it was something that Baha said on a prep call we had this week, where he talked about the way that Zionism has obscured this huge diversity of ways to be Jewish. And that I think that right now, what we're suddenly seeing in this moment of terror and horror and resistance is this huge diversity of ways to be Jewish, whether that is with JVP, Namod, the rabbis that were arrested on the border with Gaza last night, trying to take food in and protest against starvation. And I guess on a very personal level, it made me realize how Zionism had occupied a bit of me, that actually I have internalized that feeling of that I'm not the right kind of Jew, or I'm not Jewish enough. And so I think at the moment, without getting to navel gazing, we also are seeing a battle for what it means to be Jewish, with the way that anti-Semitism is being thrown around in the context of huge violence being done to Jews who are protesting by the states in which that's happening. And it made me think of something that happened a few years ago at an Indian restaurant in North London that I was in with my dad, who is here today. And it was a very empty restaurant, and it was just the two of us having a conversation about Zionism. And there was one other couple sitting on a table, like one across from us. And we were talking about Zionism. And I could tell at some point, I was like, I think they're listening to our conversation. And then they were, and then they interrupted our conversation, and they said, "You're being racist. You're being anti-Semitic." And I was like, "Oh, are you Jewish?" And they were like, "No, we're not Jewish." And I was like, "Oh, I'm Jewish. Do you know what Zionism is?" And they didn't really know what Zionism was. And that incident just shows like how deep this sense that to be anti-Israel is to be anti-Semitic is in the ether. So it feels like, that's why this film is so important, is to start to be able to expose that.
Thanks, Ella. I think, sort of whilst watching this film and listening to you talk there, I think it's the third time I've watched this film, and I sort of there's like a lot of things going on whilst I'm watching it. Sometimes I find I almost can't actually connect with the horrors of what the Palestinians are suffering, because I'm so kind of subsumed by the deep sadness that I feel I think as you were sort of saying, the way that, like, because it's personal, it's this obsession with Israel and this emphasis on Israel as being the only way you can identify as Jewish. There's like a spiritual loss, I think, that occurs. We've seen in the last month, since October the 7th, more and more Jews are coming forward. Someone said, I think the other night, coming out of the woodwork. We're like, I think for so long people have been told that they're not Jewish enough, or they're a self-hating Jew is a common one. Do you see hope in that?
I see hope in spaces of solidarity. I see hope in Palestinians and Jews coming together, not as Palestinians and Jews necessarily, but as people who are going to resist imperialism and the sort of global push for a stronghold, really, for America and other countries within the Middle East to sort of, as Israel's been called, the attack dog of America, and sometimes the attack dog leads the imperialist owner, and sometimes the imperialist kind of parent state power, I don't know which phrase to use, controls the attack dog. And it's that kind of relationship. So those of us who are outside of that, who make a conscious decision to step outside of those two powers and to unite, that feels really hopeful. That feels really, really important. The professors who are kind of guarding the students in the camps, that feels hopeful. The multiplicity and diversity of those camps feels really hopeful. That's where my hope lies.
I don't know if it directly answers your question, but I think something that it feels important to say is that on the one hand, this is a really important conversation, and we need, as Jews, to stand up and say it is not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. We need to say it again and again and again. And like, if we stay in a conversation about anti-Semitism, that is where Israel wants us to be. That is where they want the focus to be. Like, we have to keep pivoting. So we have to say, okay, it is not anti-Semitic to criticize the state of Israel, and look at what is happening. Look at the children being murdered. Look at the collective starvation. Look at the mass graves. And that is the tension of this moment. As Erin spoke about, the fact that the student encampments get more coverage than mass graves is a deep part of the problem. And so I think for those of us who feel it's really important to contest these accusations of anti-Semitism, we also have a responsibility to keep pivoting the debate to what is happening on the ground.
So we had one question. Is it quick? And then we're going to wrap up for the evening.
I've got a couple of Jewish friends in North London, in the Jewish heartland, and they're against what the state of Israel's doing, but they're so scared about speaking up, scared of losing their friends, and more importantly, their family, who are all pro-Israeli. What advice can you offer to them, and do you offer like an outreach service for people like that? Or a document?
That's a really good question. Yeah, thank you. I don't know of an outreach service, but I do know there was, I think was it If Not Now, or was it Namod recently did a resource for having difficult conversations with your family around Passover, and that would be something to sort of signpost them to. Also, I mean, the reality is that a lot of people who are in Namod or who are engaging with Namod also have similar experiences. Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of people who, still have, it's not easy, because if you've grown up thinking that Israel is the root of Jewish safety and this and that and the other, like it's not, you might not feel 100%, you might feel like there's a bit of you that you're afraid of losing, but you also know that something is deeply wrong. So I think they will find those people within Namod. Yeah, I think there's lots of people in Namod who are in that process. Yeah, that's what I could recommend. I don't know if anyone else has any suggestions. Oh, Erin's got. Hello, Erin.
Hey, yeah, I actually had to go. I have to go in a quick minute. I just want to really thank everybody for being here. I want to thank Baha again for playing such a large role in my life and for being part of this. Yeah, and obviously what you guys are talking about is a large part of what the film addresses, and it's been easier for me. My family was very welcoming and very understanding when I began questioning, and I remember conversations with my dad where I was talking about the occupation. He's like, "Yeah, that sounds really bad." My father was very quickly able to realize that something was wrong. And again, it's a very difficult thing. I assume it was also difficult for South Africans, right, to have to consider either being on the right side of history and fighting for justice, or trying not to make a fuss with their family members who were supporting apartheid. And everyone has to make those personal decisions and decide what they want to do, and it's never an easy decision. But again, I think all of us are going to look back at this time and think about, in 10, 20 years and think about what we did, and think about how much we tried and how much discomfort we were willing to put ourselves through to fight for justice overall. So it's not an easy decision, but hopefully everybody can figure out small ways in their lives they can push their loved ones and their friends. And thank you all so much again. Anybody can watch the film on our website. Please spread the word at israelismfilm.com. Please follow Baha's amazing work at To Be There, and please follow Baha, and thank you all so much. And I'll see you all.
Thank you. And Baha, did you have anything you wanted to share before?
Yeah, I just want to say, like, you guys unpacked so many points. To a Palestinian survivor, like, the film is loaded. Like, every second requires some kind of an explanation, even the discussion that is happening. And unfortunately, we are disconnected from precedents and the examples and inspirations in history, to the point where we think like this is the first time we deal with savage behavior of regime. Like, this is not the first time in history. If you really want to have hope, just look at indigenous wisdom in Palestine and you will find it. Like, our hope does not come from our ability to look into the future. Hope comes from the fact that over the past 4,000 years, there were 23 different civilizations that tried to eliminate people in Palestine, and they all failed. So, like, we need to have that blind belief that oppression is not sustainable on the land of Palestine. It's not. Whether in our lifetime or in 2-3 generations from now, Palestine will be free. And it will get back to the course, and it will rise from the ashes of this savage behavior. In the same way, it rose from the ashes of previous savages. Like, hope does not come from your ability to look into the future. You know, it comes from experiences we understand from human evolution over the past 4,000 years. Luckily, in Palestine, we can touch the grounds that were looked after by people who lived in the city of Jericho 10,000 years ago and all the generations afterwards. So, like, if you really want to look into to find hope, please pay attention to human evolution on the land of Palestine over the past 10,000 years and see every savage in our history as an example of failure of eliminating human beings and humanity on this land. That's one thing. The other thing is, like, one of the most genius things about supporters, defenders, and beneficiaries of Israeli criminal behaviors is that they make it a personal issue from a very young age. And we lose confidence in the process. We really think that if I speak up, I might lose a racist person. Like, where is the confidence, you know, of people who actually existed back in the 80s who told us that if my friend is racist, it's time to stop racism, like to stop that friendship. It's not like when you confront racist tendencies and so on, it's not an invitation for you to duck down and be submissive to it. It's like, have the courage to speak up, because like if you don't have the courage to speak up within a family context, is like, what's the point of you speaking up in the streets? So in the end of the day, like the genius of what is happening in here is that makes everybody feel some kind of an ownership, and it's based on the assumption of like, well, my father is racist, so I need to be submissive to his racism. No, like, you know, if you are going to succeed with your father, you will be able to succeed with everybody else in the world. It's okay. So I feel like while this conversation is happening about like how to deal with like how to deal with all the offenses that are brought into our table at home by the state of Israel, we're busy doing that, and the state of Israel is like busy murdering people. So like, in the end of the day, we need to set our priorities right, and we need to understand that everybody is born free and equal. If I want to struggle against injustice and a lack of freedom and equality, like there's a course I should follow, regardless of like how many people will hate it. The conversation we're having now is going to be irrelevant in a post-apartheid Palestine. And for us, we need to be like as confident about post-apartheid Palestine as one can be. You have a precedent in struggling against domination and rejecting domination in the form of, let's say, patriarchy. Like, what would you say if like you have a friend who's a misogynist, a beneficiary and defender and supporter of patriarchy? Like, how are you going to deal with that person? You know, that's a precedent. Apply that precedent on every aspect of domination and every aspect of like injustice, and you will find that's actually a joyful struggle. I think it's joyful to be part of struggle against injustice, against oppression, against apartheid, against like lack of fairness in general. You do have those precedents, but you need to find them. So thank you so very much for listening to me. Like I'm really thankful for. There are many first times to me, like today. The first time I'm in the Palestine Museum in Bristol is the first time I'm in an event together with Lucy. It's the first time I'm on a panel for Israelism. It's a lot of first times here.
Thank you so much, Baha. And I think that was a nice sort of note to end on, of courage and and being confident in your convictions. So yeah, thank you.